Hi, you guys, this is Carol. This section is how anatomy contributes to the evidence of evolution. Here are some pictures of different organisms, and the question is, are there evolutionary relationships between these two? So what we have shown is the arm of these different specimens here. So one bone, two bones, many bones, and fingers. That's kind of what we have. One bone, two bones, many bones, and fingers. And it repeats. One bone, two bones, many bones, and fingers. So we're using that as a comparison between these organisms. When we look at structures like that, we think of them as being homologous. That's a term you need to know. Homologous structures. So two structures are homologous if the similarities between them reflect common ancestry. So we look at these organisms and look at how very similar those bones are. And we believe that they are derived from a common ancestor that had that kind of pattern of bones. We want to compare that homologous structure to something called an analogous structure. And in this case, let's look at eyes. So eyes have a function. The function is to be able to capture light and form an image. But look, these are insect eyes, bird eyes. This is a little crab eye. And they are superficially similar. They sort of do the same thing, but it does not have the similarity that would make you think that they all came from a recent common ancestor. So we would call those structures analogous as compared to the homologous. In this case of the eyes, it's also a case of convergent evolution because this structure has evolved similarly in different organisms. It has the same function, but it does not mean that they had that common ancestor. So they needed eyes, they needed to see, and so they evolved. They all converged on this structure, which was an eye, but they all did it independently. Just like we think of a shark and a dolphin. A dolphin's a mammal, and a shark is a fish. And if you look at them closely like this, you think, oh wow, they're very similar. They must be cousins. They must be very closely related. And it turns out that they don't have such a recent common ancestor. Convergent evolution gave them that shape that is spectacular in the water because you can swim so well through water if you have that shape. There's just more pictures of them being amazingly active because of that streamlined morphology that they have. Sometimes we look at structures that seemingly don't have a function anymore in that organism, and we call those vestigial. So vestigial structure has lost its function, but is homologous to a functional structure in another species. So we think that a whale ancestor, whales are in the ocean, but whale ancestors probably had these hind legs, and they were terrestrial. Then they returned to the ocean and they lost the leg, but some of those pelvic bones stayed behind. So look at these vestigial femurs also in a snake here, we're thinking that these did have hind limbs, but they lost them. Now, why would you lose hind limbs? Isn't it better to have limbs? Well, not if you're trying to get in and out of a little hole in the ground, and your limbs might just get stuck. So a snake can slither into places that it wouldn't ordinarily if it had the legs still. So these are examples of vestigial structures that maybe had a use many, many years ago, but they have been lost over time. Whales today, this is a modern day whale, has that little bone there, reminiscent of a whale hip, of something that maybe a long time ago was actually a hip in that organism. If you go to Seymour Center, a lot of you grew up around here and you visited Seymour Center where they have the blue whale bones, and you'll see that they have them. There's a little bone and a bone. They have them sort of on a wire here because that's the position they would be in, and that is a hip. That is a vestigial structure in a whale that's now marine. What about humans? Do we have vestigial structures? So we know that in our embryos we have a tail, but just in the embryo. We have muscles to move our ears, and some people are really good at moving their ears. Muscles that make our hair stand on end when you get goosebumps can make your hair stand on end, not like my picture here, that would be exaggerated. So those are structures that are thought of as being vestigial. They no longer have a function of making you look big if your hair stands on end. Flight is interesting because different organisms can fly. A bird can fly, an insect can fly. And look at these wings. One of them with these feathers attached onto these bones that we looked at previously, arm bones, and an insect that doesn't look like arm bones at all. In fact, they don't have bones, they have an exoskeleton, making it very different. So in the bird, it's the modified limb bone. In an insect, it's just an outgrowth of that exoskeleton. So what do you think? That would be analogous or a homologous structure? In this case, it would be analogous. Let's look at embryonic development patterns. These are really good to look at. Which do you think is human? Because this can also provide evolutionary clues. What do these organisms look like when they're developing? Do they look very similar? That's the chimp, that's the human. Could you guess? When they're a fetus, very hard to guess. When it's an adult, they grow at different rates, the different parts of the skull, and then it becomes very evident which is which. Okay, which is human? Any of these? Take a good look. Now I'll let you see a little bit more. Now, which is human? A little bit more. The human was this one. And look how very different it looks from a rabbit or a turtle. Not at all. When it's developing, it looks very similar. Then the developmental rates accelerate at different velocities, and they look quite different. So this can give us clues to similarities in organisms if they look very alike during development. The end of this short mini lecture.